So my name is Peter Quigley. I'm the CEO and chairman of LoCi Controls. LoCi was founded 10 years ago by two MIT grad students, and their concept was to apply real-time data and control technology, colloquially called Internet of Things, to be applied in the capture of methane at landfills. And it turns out landfills are the most concentrated source of methane emissions. Methane emissions have recently become the #1 priority to slow the rate of global warming. And LoCi is an opportunity to leverage this technology to enhance methane recovery at landfills in a way that we believe will reduce greenhouse gas emissions faster and at lower cost than any other company over the next 5 years in the world. So I think we're all familiar. I mean, going back to maybe the inconvenient truth with Al Gore, but essentially for 40 years, environmental policy has been focused on CO2 emission reduction. And the three big examples that people are most familiar with are wind, solar, and electric vehicles. All three of those, the objective was to reduce CO2 emissions compared to the alternatives, which would be coal-fired power plants, natural gas, case of vehicles, gas or diesel. It's been unfortunately until very recently that people really appreciated the very harmful impact of methane. And to give you a perspective, when CO2 is emitted into the atmosphere, it has a negative effect on greenhouse gas warming for hundreds of years. And by contrast, when methane is emitted, it breaks down in less than 20 years. And during that time frame, the impact of methane is 85 times worse than CO2. But it wasn't until 2021 that the UN IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, made the following statement: if the world doesn't reduce methane emissions by half in the next 10 years, we will not be able to slow the rate of global warming to stay below 1.5 degrees C perceived tipping point. And the thing that's very sobering about that is we've had 40 years of policy directed towards CO2 emission reduction, and we've had essentially less than 3 where the world's climate experts have recognized that methane is actually the most important priority because the effect is so harmful and it's so short-lived. So LoCi really anticipated that methane emission reduction was going to become important. It's just now becoming recognized by governments and carbon policy experts. And to give you another example, and then I'll stop. When the UN IPCC at COP24 made this statement about methane, this was in May of 2021. By November of 2021, the US with the European Union created a global methane pledge. There have now been 130 countries have signed the global methane pledge, committing countries to reduce methane emissions by half over 10 years in line with the UN IPCC recommendations. Prior to that, there was 0 countries that were focused on methane emission reduction. So very recent, critically important, and now there is relatively little policy to incentivize this behavior. So I think we're going to see that change, and there's a lot more public attention on methane emission reduction, and I think the government policy and regulations are going to be following. 3 large sources: the upstream oil and gas leakage. So in other words, in the production of natural gas and oil, the unplanned for release of methane. Livestock and livestock are very large sources of methane emissions, and everybody thinks about the waste and the manure, but actually the way that dairy cows, as an example, digest food, they actually produce methane in their stomachs. So the three large sources of methane emissions that are man-made are the upstream oil and gas sector, livestock, and then landfills. And just to give you a perspective, the EPA estimates are upstream oil and gas and livestock both are about the same size. But to give you an example, there are 100 million dairy cows in the US, and there are between 3 and 5 million estimated point sources of methane emissions in the upstream oil and gas sector. By contrast, the estimates by the EPA of landfill emissions are half of oil and gas and livestock, but there's only 1,000 large landfills in the US that are the source of the methane emissions. So there are several orders of magnitude more concentrated. You know where they are. You don't have to cut down trees to get to them. There's already infrastructure, and there's not millions of them. So I think that's a really major difference, is landfills are really the low-hanging fruit for methane emission reduction, and it can be addressed very quickly. Well, up until about 1980, there were 10,000 quite literally dumps that look a lot like what you see in the developing world. And it was only under the Clean Air Act that they recognized that there were very, very large emissions from solid waste. So regulations were put in effect in 1996. It took almost 20 years to regulate the landfill sector. The largest landfills were required to put in methane capture systems. And to give you a perspective, because of those regulations, about 75% of the dumps in the United States closed, because the cost of putting in these capture systems was high. But for the last 25 years, the operation of the collection systems, the design, is all based on regulatory policy. So in other words, the EPA established requirements for large landfills to capture the methane. And that regulatory approach has effectively never been updated in 25 years, and it permits, and in fact requires, once per month manual measurements and manual adjustments and reporting to the EPA or the regulatory body every 6 months. And what LoCi did is put real-time data and control on the existing landfill gas collection infrastructure, with the goal of maximum recovery of methane and minimizing emissions. So historically, the infrastructure is there, but it's never been operated in a way that's designed to optimize the capture. And to give you an example, the EPA estimates that the collection efficiency of the existing infrastructure is only 58%. So nearly half of the methane that's being generated is escaping into the atmosphere. By applying real-time data and control that's cloud connected, that allows for operation both with automation, but also to support the people that are at landfills operating these systems, we can reduce emissions by at least half. So it's a really super simple and in many ways intuitive. But you said, Chris, earlier, who is your customer? It's the landfill's job is to meet the regulatory requirement. It's really, we believe our customer are all of us that are focused on greenhouse gas emission reduction, including governments and corporations, because LoCi has the ability to achieve greenhouse gas emission faster and at lower cost and at greater scale than really anything else. I would say we're gaining commercial traction. We're not a startup. We're still losing money. So you could say that's not sustainable, but we're operating now at about 50 landfills. The industry is a very slow adopter. Half of the landfills are large public companies. Waste Management, Republic Services, between them have about half of the roughly 1,000 landfills in the US. The other half are municipalities or county publicly owned landfills that are operated by the municipality or the local government. So you might imagine their primary focus is ensuring that they're meeting compliance, but traditionally landfills have not been incentivized to maximize recovery. So So that gives you a sense of slow, difficult, heavily regulated industry that isn't incentivized to maximize recovery. So the adoption, we believe, has been reasonable but slower than we'd like. But I think that's changing because there's a lot of increasing pressure on methane emission reduction, and this is a solution that's actually working, demonstrated, delivering results, and is well past the startup stage. It's, solar, little batteries, electronics, modems connected to the cloud, no infrastructure changes. We can just drop in and drop out on the collection system. And, to give you an idea now, we have just under 5,000 of these collection points fully instrumented with automated valve adjustments, and it's really easy to be able to add this infrastructure because we're essentially piggybacking on infrastructure that's been required by regulations over the last 25 years. So really simple. You know exactly where these landfills are. You can pull them up on Google Maps and just drop in this capability of enhancing the control in a way that has immediate impact. The U.S. Senate and the Committee on Environment and Public Works had a recent hearing on the need to reduce methane emissions from landfills. And the White House put out a plan in 2021 that was the White House methane plan. And unfortunately, in that plan, they relied upon voluntary action by the landfill industry to enhance methane recovery. And, the incentives aren't quite right to make that happen. So what started to happen is increasingly there are nonprofits such as the Rocky Mountain Institute. The Environmental Defense Fund just announced a joint effort with Google to launch a satellite that's detecting methane emissions. The nonprofits are starting to recognize the need to drive methane emission reduction. And the Rocky Mountain Institute in particular, I think, has been advocating in Washington to pay attention to this issue. So during that hearing, we never met with Senator Markey, even though we're a Massachusetts-based company. He was well aware of LoCi and talked about our impact. And to give you an idea on those 50 projects we're now operating, we've reduced methane emissions over the last 5 years by more than 4 million metric tons. And most people can't relate to what that means, but that's the equivalent of taking about 850,000 passenger vehicles off the road for a year. And thinking of it in another way, it's the amount of CO2 that a forest would absorb in a year if the entire state of Connecticut was covered by a forest. So it would be 5 million acres worth of forest absorbing CO2. So that gives you an idea of the impact of a relatively small number of projects in a relatively short time period. And Senator Markey was aware of that. He called out that this small early stage company based in Wareham, Massachusetts has reduced methane emissions by 4 million tons of CO2 equivalent, and that number is spot on. So I think he was the Rocky Mountain Institute. I'd probably given him some background on LoCi, and we were very appreciative that he recognized the work that we're doing. In fact, there was a believability aspect. I didn't come from the environmental industry. In fact, I had a background in commercializing technology in the oil field service. So when I started to really do the math and recognize the emissions reduction impact as opposed to enhancing the capture of methane, actually the inverse, which is how much emissions were we preventing, the numbers were really, really staggering. And, that's when we began to recognize that, and it's a dramatic thing to say. I mean, that statement that I made, we can say with conviction, we believe we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions faster and at lower cost over the next 5 years than any other company in the world. and it requires no land use. Like, we don't have to cut down trees. We don't have to, put windmills on the top of mountains. So it's really a staggering opportunity, and we have to get it done. I mean, it's the industry is not focused on this, meaning the solid waste industry. We're the ones, unlike the oil and gas sector, which is trying to capture methane. The solid waste industry is only doing it because it's required. It's not their business to capture methane. So this is a case where getting the incentives right, and also taking advantage of the opportunity to buy more time for technologies that are going to take more time to become effective, whether it's direct air capture or new nuclear that's no emissions, or a greater expansion of renewables, or electrification of transportation. All those things are just going to take time. Reducing methane emission is what needs to be done quickly. Unequivocally, California is way out front with this. They hired NASA and the Jet Propulsion Lab. They did a two-year aerial survey of methane emissions in the state of California. They published those results in 2019. They found that half of the methane emissions in the state of California were from landfills. So California is so out front in the United States on methane emission reduction. Other states are now adopting some of the policies that California has implemented. But by far and away in the United States, California is way out front. Unfortunately, the corporate world is still focused on the voluntary carbon markets. I primarily focused on CO2. You've heard a lot of the large tech companies are collaborating to work on direct air capture, and a lot of the consumer companies are focused on nature solutions like forestry. So methane is not well understood in the corporate voluntary world. We think that will change over time, but California is way out front, and they're implementing quite innovative policy to drive methane emission reduction in California. We're a company that's based in southeastern Massachusetts. I had a former company that was also based in that part of the state before it was in Texas. Just super bullish as a place to be a global company with a home in Massachusetts. We appreciate the work that AIM does, and frankly, we wouldn't look to be anywhere else, even if we have people all over the country. Massachusetts has been a great place to build a business.